Okay, well, we're going to get started. Good morning and welcome, everyone, to the first webinar in our quarterly series, a new quarterly series that will address issues related to implementing the NCTSN Resource Parent Curriculum, or Caring for Children Who've Experienced Trauma, a workshop for resource parents. And this series is presented by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's Resource Parent Subcommittee. And the title of today's presentation, or the first webinar in our series, is Getting Started with the NCTSN Resource Parent Curriculum, or What's in It for Me. So we could go to the slide that says Learning Objectives. As you can see, we're hoping today to sort of introduce everyone to how the curriculum can be used to increase foster care placement stability and how it can be adapted and modified to meet the needs of individual agencies and communities. We hope to answer some of the questions that you might have as you sort of begin to use the curriculum materials, but we know we won't address all of them, and hopefully we'll be able to take up other issues on future webinars and in other forums, which we'll talk about later. So I'm just going to give very abbreviated introductions because we've got 5 panelists today, all of whom are NCTSN master trainers with great experience delivering the workshop in different settings and under a variety of different conditions. And most of the speakers today were also involved in the original development and pilot testing of the curriculum. And I'll introduce them all now. We can go to the slide that just lists the names of all of the presenters, so you can sort of follow along. First, our first presenter is Shannon Reagan Shaw. Shannon has been a foster parent for the Dane County Department of Human Services in Madison, Wisconsin since 2007. And in addition to fostering, Shannon is a foster parent trainer and frequent co-facilitator of the NCTSN Resource Parent Curriculum. She won the Governor's Award for Foster Care Excellence in 2010 and leads a monthly trauma-focused psychoeducational support group for foster parents called It's Not About You, which I think you'll be hearing a little bit more about. Shannon will be followed by Kelly Sullivan, who's a licensed psychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke University Medical Center. Kelly has worked at the Center for Child and Family Health since 2006 and serves as faculty on training teams for TF-CBT and parent-child interaction therapy. And in addition to facilitating RPC workshops, she's also provided training to child welfare workers using NCTSN's Child Welfare Trauma Training Toolkit. Liz Sharda is an individual NCTSN affiliate from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and recently served as the coordinator of Project Return Home at Bethany Christian Services, which provides trauma-focused counseling for children in foster care and their biological parents. Liz has trained many foster parents, adoptive parents, and service providers on trauma-related topics and has been involved with the Resource Parent Curriculum since participating in the pilot in 2009. And Liz and her husband are also foster parents. Chris Foreman, our next presenter, is an individual NCTSN affiliate as well from Madison, Wisconsin. Chris has been practicing social work within the field of children, youth, and families since 1998. She regularly trains foster parents, child welfare staff, and community stakeholders on the nature of complex trauma and its impact on child development. She's done presentations for the Wisconsin State Bar Association and court-appointed special advocates, and she's done train the facilitator events in Ohio and Iowa. And then finally, Suba Do is a member of the NCTSN Advisory Board and has worked in child-serving fields as a professional for over 30 years in adoption, foster care, juvenile justice, children's mental health, and education. She's developed curricula on many topics used to prepare professional child welfare staff, adoptive and foster parents, judges, attorneys, and youth. She serves as a director within the Knowledge Management Department of Casey Family Programs, has been a senior fellow within the Department of Justice, executive director of the Philadelphia Children's Commission, and deputy director of the Pew Commission on Children in Foster Care. And Sue and her husband are the lifetime parents of 22 children, 2 by birth and 20 adopted. And they've also served as foster parents for more than 50 children and as a host family for refugee youth from Sudan, Kosovo, and Guatemala. So thank you all very much for making the time to be with us today. We can go to the slide that says trauma-informed parenting, and I'll hand the presentation over now to Shannon Reagan-Shaw.
Thank you. When I first started doing foster care, I thought that I was reasonably well prepared and that I would be okay at it. After all, I had gone through extensive background checks, my home had been inspected, I had pre-service training to get me familiar with issues related to foster care, so I thought that I would be okay, and we could have kids come in, and I could help the kids, and I could love them enough to make it better and make a difference. That's why I wanted to do foster care in the first place. I was very quickly overwhelmed. The kids that came into our home had really high needs. There was lots of acting out. I didn't know how to handle that, and I just didn't understand why providing a firm, fair, consistent routine full of lots of love wasn't enough to help these kids have a reasonable day. And I didn't understand all the little ways that I was making it harder for those kids who had already been abused. That's the place my family was in when we very first discovered the resource parent curriculum several years ago. And it was when we went through the training, it was a fundamental paradigm shift for us in the way that we were parenting, because previously I realized I was spending a lot of time thinking about the kids' behaviors, the acting out that they were doing, and trying to focus my time on correcting the behaviors or managing the behaviors that I thought were inappropriate. I was really big into using sticker charts to watch progress on behaviors that we were looking at, and I dished out consequences or rewards depending on if the child was doing what I wanted them to do. This is all basic parenting stuff as far as I was concerned. What I didn't see at the time was that a lot of the acting out behaviors that these kids were doing were brilliant creative strategies for them to get their own needs met. Based on the life that they had before, these neglected and abused and even delinquent kids had a really hard time and had to have coping strategies that fit for the kind of life that they lived. For example, I thought that if a kid was throwing a huge fit at bedtime, then what they really needed was to learn what a normal bedtime routine looked like. So I had to be really patient and consistent in the routine so the problem would work itself out. But a trauma-informed approach is very different because it starts with the all-important why question. Why is my child consistently upset at bedtime? What needs are they trying to meet? When you start with that question, you look at the bedtime battle and think about what's going on with your child a lot different. Maybe you think about the fact that the child was sexually abused before they came into their home, and that sexual abuse happened at bedtime. So then when you think about it, the fit that they're throwing at bedtime in your house, even though your house is safe, maybe what they're thinking about at bedtime is what happened to them before. So a trauma-informed approach tells you that you need to spend your time thinking about how can you help that child to feel safe. Maybe you need to use strategies like put on a nightlight or be always available for them to call or make sure that you are always in the home because they're not sure about other people. Or maybe you find out that this was a child who was starved and neglected before. And the problem with bedtime is that they're afraid they're going to wake up hungry. They're afraid they're going to wake up and there's not going to be food to eat. And if that's what's happening at bedtime, then you can do something really easy like put food in a Ziploc bag and give that to them to keep so that they can manage their own food anxiety issues. A trauma-informed approach is fundamentally different than me putting up a sticker chart on their bedroom wall saying, if you go to bed properly without throwing a fit, we can earn a trip to Chuck E. Cheese. Let's get another sticker tonight. It's a very different approach to parenting. The other thing that was really different from the first time we went through trauma-informed parenting approaches in the resource parent curriculum was how we looked at natural consequences. Now, when we were thinking about how we can best parent these kids, we thought we need to teach them to take responsibility for themselves, and natural consequences are a great way to do it. But we didn't look at the whole picture and think about this from the child's perspective. If you take a child who's suffering from neglect and try to look at it from their perspective, on a day when they forget their coat when they're going to school and they're cold and they're wet, you might say to them, if you're going to use natural consequences, well, remember this, remember how it feels, and next time bring your coat. But the problem is that it's my job to help this child heal and feel loved. And what conclusions are they drawing about how much I care for them, or even if they're worth caring about? A trauma-informed approach to parenting taught me that many times natural consequences are totally inappropriate for our kids because of the situation that they went in before. We have to do extra work to have a positive relationship with them. And if we're simply allowing them to feel cold or to feel hungry, wanting that to be the lesson in and of themselves, what we've found is that the lesson they're really learning is that we don't care about them and we're just like those other people who didn't take good care of them before. We had a lot of success when we changed our parenting approaches after going through RPC the first time. And we really wanted to share this with other people. So when the resource parent curriculum was being offered again in our area, we went back to help co-facilitate it. It was really exciting for us to be able to share some of our success stories with other parents. It was really inspiring for other foster parents who were being introduced to the material for the first time to hear about how thinking about it from the child's perspective, thinking about how you can help them to feel safe in your home, even though you know your home is safe, and thinking about how the reactions that they're having for things sometimes are because they're kids, and sometimes it's because these really hard things they went through, was really exciting for other foster parents to talk to. And many of the foster parents, when we were co-facilitating, ended up telling us that a really valuable part of the training was being able to talk to us, people who had been through the material, people who had tried it, people who had some successes and learned some hard lessons while they were doing it, was really valuable. Because the end result is foster parents can spend a lot of time going through training so that they can get all of their hours in to be licensed and not use the material if they don't see how it can be used, how it can make a difference for their lives as they're going through it. And what my husband and I found out when we were facilitating the material and going through it a second time was that we didn't absorb even a quarter of the material from the first time we went through RPC. One of the biggest things that stands out to me from going through it a second time was when we started thinking about the difference between the developmental age of the child and the chronological age. See, at the time, we were fostering a teenager who was having a really hard time in her life, and we were stressed out and frustrated because this 15-year-old girl was acting like a 5-year-old every time she was mad. And we would get frustrated with her, and it was really stressful to have this older child not act her age. And when we went through RPC the second time, we started thinking about what the effect of all those years of abuse and neglect had on her and how her emotional development had stalled around that age. And until she learns the skills that you would normally teach to a 5-year-old, her temper tantrums when she's upset are going to stay that way. And it took all the pressure off of us feeling like we were doing something wrong, like we weren't being good parents when we went through. And what I found as I've facilitated this information again and again is that each time I do it, I learn something new. And every time I learn something new, it helps my family. And every time I talk to another foster parent who's going through the information for maybe the first time or even the second time, and I can talk about how I'm learning new things, trying new approaches, being able to talk with other trauma-informed parents about how we can do our job, how we can best help these kids, is one of the best parts about going to do it again. And the truth is, no matter how well the training is taught, no matter how valuable the information, what a great trainer it is facilitating it, if you can't make it applicable right away for the parents in the training, all of that wonderful, helpful information is going to be lost. And you can't make it applicable unless you incorporate what's happening with the people in the training to what's happening in the training. The whole idea of having foster parents co-facilitating the training shouldn't be an afterthought. Foster parents should be there from the very beginning because they're the people using this information. And they're the people in the best place to provide those examples showing how does this work? What does this parenting style look like? And being able to talk with it. In addition to the fact that if you don't have people that are really knowledgeable about the material in your area that can help talk and continue the conversation with other foster parents, then all of that information is going to be lost. It will be forgotten. You'll have the crisis of the day in your home, and you're going to forget all about what that trauma-informed approach might have looked like unless you're already practiced in using it and talking with other people who are trying to use it too. So I think that not only has it been invaluable for us to be able to go back and review the material and co-facilitate and help guide those discussions, but it's also been really important to me and my family being able to become well-practiced in learning these parenting approaches because it was so fundamentally different than what we were trying to do in the beginning. And we wouldn't have had the success that we've had with these kids and felt like we were able to make a difference, help them heal, help them to feel loved, if we didn't know how to handle all of the hard parts about it too. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Kelly.
Oh, thank you so much, Shannon. Wow. It's very inspirational, and I can't believe I have to go next, but I will. So before I talk about the facilitator guidelines in this slide, so I, just direct your attention away from the slide at the moment, I want to let the audience know my perspective on what I think is a very unique trauma-informed parenting workshop. My perspective comes from my experience providing treatment for kids with mental health problems who've been exposed to trauma, so it's really through a therapist's lens that I see this workshop. So even though I passionately believe that therapy for children, especially when it involves their caregivers, can be absolutely transformative, I truly recognize, and I think most other people do, that there are serious limits to therapy. There are limits with access to qualified clinicians. There are, of course, always logistical barriers that children and families have to face to get treatment. We are still dealing with the stigma associated with mental health treatment. So there's all those limits, but the reality is, too, is that some children's needs just don't rise to the level of actually requiring therapy at one moment in time when maybe they could have gotten therapy, or perhaps it just never in their lives does it raise to that level. So realistically, therapists alone have limited ability to improve children's functioning, which is likely the reason most of evidence-based treatments available for kids heavily involve parents in treatment. So, obviously, if Shannon didn't emphasize this enough, parents are the key. I think the main reason why parents are the key is because parents, and specifically resource parents, and when we use that term, we mean foster, adoptive, and kinship providers, those sort of sometimes temporary, but then sometimes it does turn into being permanent caregivers. So these parents, when we're considering the children who are involved with the child welfare system, these parents have better access to and are often the most pivotal person in that child's life. And personally, I think the most critical ways we improve a child's functioning through therapy is truly being supportive of caregivers in their parenting of the child and using the caregiver to extend the reach of therapy through serving as the child's coach on the therapeutic techniques daily outside of session. So for me, with all that being said, sort of through the therapy lens, for me, RPC fills a number of really critical gaps in the needs of children who are or who have been involved in the child welfare system. And there are 4 gaps that I think it fills. So first, I know that there are plenty of kids out there that don't have needs that rise to the level of requiring therapy. What they do need, though, is their caregivers supporting them appropriately to promote optimal functioning and hopefully prevent them from developing more of a need for therapy in the future. And I think RPC can do this. secondly, when there's not good access to therapy, and we know that that continues to be a problem, is caregivers can fill that hole a bit or perhaps even a lot, for example, in Shannon's situation in particular, and respond more therapeutically to kids in their home. And I feel like RPC can do this too. So a third gap that I think RPC can fill is for when a child's needs are higher and that child is in therapy, a trauma-informed parent wraps the child with appropriate support. I think a trauma-informed therapist would and should just eat this stuff up, in all honesty, from the therapist's perspective. The material covered and in the way that it's covered are the very things that I want the parents to know for children I work with in therapy. The workshop not only creates awareness, but is also chock full of specific skills for parents. And last but not least, this workshop advocates and informs caregivers about trauma-informed assessment and treatment. So these parents will likely just get it. They'll just get why they should refer their kids to treatment when it's needed, and they'll be more informed consumer advocates for their children about the type of treatment they should be getting. So the material is presented in such an accessible way that it connects with a quite variable audience. I want, the people on this call to know that I have used it with parents with a broad range of skills, of course, but also with professionals, including therapists, judges, child welfare, and lots of other professionals. And I refer to this material in most of my training just because it's that good. So if we get back to the slide now, if you look at the line across the bottom, across the arrow line, it's got training on the right side and intervention. It could be therapy or treatment rather than the word intervention. This continuum is my attempt at explaining how I think RPC is much more than just a training. So for training, the relationship between the trainer and the trainee is pretty unessential. I think we could probably agree on that. For a training, it tends to be a larger number of trainees. Their trainings are also not typically capable of addressing individualized needs. So that's kind of training at one end. And then for sort of at the other end, we have intervention or treatment or therapy. So for individual and group therapy, relationship between the therapist and the parent, if they're participating, and the therapist and child is key. It's a key piece of therapy. Also, for intervention, you're typically looking at a smaller size of group that's involved in that. And then part of that reason is that the smaller the size, the more targeted the intervention to the child and to the parent's individualized needs. So if we just take that continuum, and originally I had wanted the slide to be animated, but it wasn't possible. So now if you just look up toward the box on the left, which is the pre-service training, I feel like, most states require pre-service training for foster parents. And I feel like pre-service training is a really good example at one end of this continuum for training that we provide to resource parents. So then if you look at the other end of the spectrum, we, of course, have individual therapy. And all those things that I talked about before for individual therapy are true, that it's very individualized, that relationship between the therapist and the person who's in therapy is key. And then, next to that, moving a little bit over to the right, we have group therapy. And, this is just the Kelly version of where group therapy could go. Other people might think it's much closer to individual therapy than where I have it placed, and, that's fine. So group therapy is definitely an intervention, but I think it's inherently less individualized. And so I sort of moved it further down the continuum. And so where does RPC go? And I feel like it's somewhere around here where you see it. It's sort of in the middle. I think it does depend from facilitator to facilitator where this could fall. But I think inherently here in the middle and maybe moving toward the intervention side is pretty realistic. So I think it should just be known to everybody who's thinking about doing this that it's more than just training. And that's why I think, and that's why many of us think that some clinical skills and some savvy are really important in this role for facilitators and for the co-facilitators. So some of the examples that come to mind for me of why this workshop is further down the continuum toward intervention is, well, one, I use my clinical experience, and Shannon talked about this too in terms of all of her experiences, so I use my experience providing therapy to children as examples throughout the workshop. These examples are critical to make sure that the material is connecting with the range of needs of the parents participating. So the other piece, though, is that this workshop is structured in a way that the parent focuses the application of the material to one's child, which makes it more individualized and arguably more therapeutic. Next thing to consider is that the workshop attempts to address what we sometimes just refer to as baffling behavior. So sometimes parents bring up very challenging behavioral issues. One thing that I thought of is, why is my school-age child hiding their soiled underwear? And, the parents often aren't going to ask it in that way. They're going to say it in some other way. But they ask those kinds of questions, and they're very challenging, and it's helpful to have some additional information to support parents in being able to understand that behavior and helping them approach it. Lastly, parents really can experience a wide range of emotions when they process the material. From thinking about their own trauma history, because definitely some of the parents who will participate in these workshops will have their own trauma histories. So that could be one sort of range. They also, sometimes we're encountering parents who are experiencing a tremendous amount of guilt about how they have parented other children that have been in their care previously. And it really requires a great deal of care about how to address that. So I just wanted people to be really mindful of that. And I think that's a lot of the reasoning and the rationale behind why the facilitator guidelines were developed. So you can access the facilitator guidelines on the Learning Center site, and we intend and hope for people to read them before downloading the curriculum. And we also want you all to use them to guide your actual implementation. So a few things I would highlight from these guidelines are that facilitators, both what's considered the staff facilitator, which tends to be the sort of either the therapist type person or maybe the child welfare worker, that kind of person, and then the parent co-facilitator. And in our groups here, we actually often use an adult who is an alumni, a foster care alumni. So she speaks about her own experience being involved with the child welfare system and being parented by a resource parent. So for both of those facilitators, it's truly best that they are steeped in trauma knowledge and that they should know the curriculum well before beginning. So even though this workshop was beautifully put together by the curriculum developers to make it easier to use, you really can't just pick it up and do it effectively without getting more knowledge on it first. We are realistic, however, about getting this workshop out there, and we know that many people will want to do this that aren't the most trauma-informed right now. And that's why we definitely recommend that those interested in conducting these workshops, especially if you aren't a part of the NCTSN, that you could get connected through the Learning Center site and with master trainers. So my last thought is that this is, as you can tell, what I think is a truly an amazing product that the network has developed, and we are really excited for people to be using it more and getting connected with us so that we can continue to learn the most we can about how to use it effectively. So now I'll turn it over to Liz Sharda for key considerations about conducting these workshops.
Thank you, Kelly. Similar to Kelly, I want to just kind of share, first of all, where I'm coming from. I'm a social worker here in Michigan with background in child welfare, as was noted earlier, but I'm also a foster parent. So as Kelly was talking, I was nodding along and thinking about how, as a professional, I want to use her slide, just pull it right out and use it with organizations that I'm talking to about implementing this curriculum to kind of explain the background and the foundation of this curriculum. And while Shannon was talking, I was thinking about things that my husband and I can do differently with our 8-year-old foster son. So I'm kind of simultaneously wearing both of those hats. So I thank Shannon and Kelly both for their presentations. So getting into this slide, the key considerations. Now that the foundation has sort of been laid in terms of why this curriculum is valuable and how it's being utilized, we thought it would be good to spend a little bit of time on sort of the nitty-gritty details that come up when an organization is considering implementation of the RPC. As Kelly noted, we do encourage you to visit the RPC space on the Learning Center. There's several resources there that can help with planning, and most notably, there's a section called Ask the Master Trainer, where you can post questions that will then be directed to one of us or another master trainer who can provide an individualized answer for you. But we do want to touch on some key considerations today, just to get the wheels turning on how you might plan this in your location. So one of the first things to consider is how to structure the training in terms of whether it's offered in one large chunk over the course of 2 back-to-back days, or whether it's more spread out over the course of a few weeks, maybe one evening per week over the course of 6 weeks. And it's been done in a variety of ways. And what we want to encourage is that you would just consider the needs of your families. One thing to consider is just the geographic location of families. Are they all kind of centralized and could make weekly trips to the training location, or are they coming from far away, and would it make more sense to have the training offered in one long session? One of the things that we have found is that due to the really application-based focus of the curriculum, it's really helpful to have the curriculum spread out over several training sessions. This is because it gives a chance for the families who are attending to kind of go home and chew on the things that they've learned through the curriculum, and to implement it, to try it out, to think about it, and then come back and say, you know, this worked, but this didn't. Or I've been thinking about this and have been wondering this. It really gives a chance for the families to interact with the material in the curriculum in a way that isn't as possible if the curriculum is offered over the course of 2 straight days. Another important question is who should participate, and this comes up as one of the first questions when we're talking to organizations who are considering using the RPC. And really, when we think about who should participate, we think that the resource parent curriculum was designed for just that, resource parents. Substitute caregivers, as Kelly mentioned, when we use the blanket term resource parents, we mean foster parents, kinship caregivers, adoptive parents. And this is who the curriculum was really designed for. At the same token, we know that the material is really beneficial and can be applied to other groups as well. We know that it has been used with residential staff, direct care staff, who are also substitute caregivers for the youth in their locations. It has also been used on a limited basis with biological parents, and this has been both with just groups of just biological parents and also mixed groups with foster parents also included. And what we want to stress in that case, if that's something that you would consider, is that you would connect with a master trainer and talk about some of the different dynamics that might arise when offering it to birth parents. And there is also a resource that was developed by the NCTSN on adapting the RPC for birth parents. In terms of using it with resource parents, however, we found that using this with the groups of resource parents post-placement, so parents who already have their adoptive child or foster child or children placed in their homes, is really the most beneficial. The reason for this is that when and if it's offered pre-placement, that application focus is lost. There's a lot of application throughout the curriculum, and those attending as a pre-service will not get as much out of it in that regard. There's one specific, it's an activity, but really it's an intervention called the My Child worksheet that is used throughout every module of the RPC. And in the beginning of the RPC, parents are asked to identify one child that they want to focus on throughout the entire training. And in each module, the parents are asked to apply one piece of what they've learned to that particular child. And this is one of my favorite pieces of the RPC, and we've found that it is one of the most valuable pieces for parents, especially parents who are struggling with a particular child's behaviors or who are just scratching their heads as to why they're seeing what they're seeing in their homes. And so this My Child worksheet is incredibly valuable for those families that do already have foster or adoptive children who've experienced trauma already placed in their homes. Another question that comes up around who to include in the training is whether or not to include child welfare workers. And again, it's important to consider your location and the dynamics of workers and foster parents and what has been done at trainings in the past. But a few things to note is that this can be incredibly helpful to have child welfare workers present, in that they're hearing what the foster parents or resource parents are hearing. They're getting the same information. They're learning alongside them. And hopefully they would then in turn be able to revisit it and implement it down the road. It's really helpful to have child welfare workers present in terms of getting everyone on the same page and speaking the same language. So that's kind of the pro side to including child welfare workers in this training. On the other hand, we want to preserve the training as kind of a safe space for resource parents to share their struggles without feeling like they can do that in a safe way and in a free way. And so what we recommend and what I've found to be helpful is to keep the ratio kind of low in terms of child welfare workers to resource parents participating. And I've found that around 1 to 5 workers to parents is pretty effective. Again, consider the needs of your group and the climate of the organization or community, and do what's best for your organization. In terms of the size of the group, as Kelly mentioned, it's not a normal training. It's not just a didactic presentation. It's very interactive. Interaction between facilitators and participants, between participants and other participants is key to getting the most out of this curriculum. And what we know is that when a group gets too large, group participation goes down. So what we've found is that 10 to 20 participants is really optimal for having group discussions and sharing among resource parents. I've done it with as few as 6, as many as 30. I think others have done it with other size groups, but one of the conclusions that we've drawn is somewhere around 10 to 20 is really optimal. If a group needs to be larger, just based on the needs of your organization, consider assigning small groups that will stick together throughout the training so that there is some sense of a smaller community within that larger training group. And kind of as a side note, once you've done the training a few times, you can bring back resource parents like Shannon to lead those small discussion groups. And really just the important thing to note here is that interaction is key, and so you want to keep that in mind when considering the size of your group, and that there's a thread of mutual support and sharing and encouragement that runs throughout this training that is incredibly valuable to families and really amazing to watch as a facilitator. How do we get resource parents to sign up? This has been admittedly a struggle in my area and in my agency. And really the breakthrough happened when we started, and it seems so obvious now, but it wasn't at the time, when we started using resource parents who had gone through the curriculum to recruit other resource parents. Some of our most active families in our trainings have come because a resource parent who came before or who was co-facilitating the training told them that they should come. It wasn't because of the flyers that I designed and sent out. It was because somebody told them that this was going to be incredibly helpful to them. So once you've done the training, it's important to get testimonials from parents and ask them to tell their friends and spread the word. Also ask case managers, child welfare workers, to encourage their families to attend, especially those who they know might be struggling with a certain child or children. And really, what I want to note is that once the families are there, or even in terms of getting them there, supports are really important, and there's a few that we have found to really make the difference between whether foster parents will attend or not. Food and child care really are the big ones. And speaking as a resource parent, if I know that food and child care will be offered, it makes a great deal of difference because resource families are incredibly busy, and that makes a big difference. Training credits are another one. If you can work with the child welfare agencies to be able to offer training credits. It's different in different jurisdictions in terms of the amounts of credits needed, but that's another sort of incentive or support to offer to resource parents. Really the biggest support is that once they're there, they'll find support with each other and from the facilitators. And the encouragement and learning that happens among families is the biggest source of support. And that's really what will keep them coming back and will make them your biggest proponents in the future. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a few of the resources that I mentioned that are available to you as you consider implementing the RPC in your area. And these are all available on the Learning Center. I'll again mention the Ask the Master Trainer feature where you can post questions, especially if we don't get to them today. You can post questions to Master Trainers. And finally, I will turn it over to Chris Foreman to discuss how to keep the conversation going once the training is over.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Chris Foreman, and I'm a social worker in southern Wisconsin. And when I found this curriculum and started implementing it, my goal was to stop the cycle of placement disruptions. I was working in the foster care unit of my child welfare agency with young boys ages 5 to 12, and they were cycling through homes and group homes and residential treatment centers. And I was looking for a way to help families understand those tough, challenging behaviors so that these kids could stay put and not have to move around so much. So I began with a pilot, and when I started doing this training, my approach was a couple hours a night over a course of 6 weeks. And my colleagues would sort of prepare me by saying, if you tell families that they have to show up for 6 weeks in a row or they can't come at all, nobody's going to sign up. And they would tell me that it's not realistic. I mean, it's way too much to ask to expect families to tailor their parenting style to meet the needs of every single child that comes into their home. But rather, as social workers, it's our job to find good fits between the needs of the kids and the skill sets of the parents. What I found after I started doing this training, however, was just the opposite. That when we use this curriculum and we give families the tools that just really make sense, that reflect the realities of their daily struggles with kids, parents are willing to do just about anything. The majority of the foster parents I've worked with over the last few years with this training have made it very clear that they got into fostering to help kids. And if I'm able to give them some tools that help them accomplish that goal, they're willing to jump in with both feet and not only become users, but become advocates. What I've also, however, learned is that this, as Shannon had said earlier, really is a total paradigm shift for a lot of participants, and it can't be expected to have that happen, that shift of parenting perspective, in the course of 15 or 16 hours. I'll speak for myself when I say that I think a lot of people grow up learning that if you want to increase a behavior, you reward it. If you want a kid or a person to stop a behavior, you consequence it. I mean, that's why I get tickets on the interstate for speeding too fast. And so all of our systems and our parenting in a lot of ways really reinforce that rewards and consequences approach, which isn't unhelpful, but it doesn't do it all. And sometimes the most effective response is really unique. And I'll give you an example. I have a foster parent co-trainer, Donna, who she and her husband are fostering and or have adopted and have birthed children, 7 girls in their house. And this summer they decided that for the first time in many, many years, they were going to go away for their anniversary. They were going to have a night out, and all the kids were going to go somewhere, whether it's grandma's house or a friend's sleepover. Or basically what they were doing is they were getting a respite for the weekend so that they could celebrate their anniversary for a change. And one of Donna's adopted daughters, as she left for respite, stole Donna's favorite necklace. And it was like, her great-grandmother's. And so it was a family heirloom, and all the kids knew this was her favorite necklace. And so when Donna discovered this, her first instinct was to be furious. How could you? But she's been doing this training with me and has not only just learned it, but learned how to live it. And so when she asked this daughter after the respite weekend was over, she said to her, what is it that made you think that you needed to take this necklace with you? Which is a very different, subtle but different question than what in the world were you thinking, child? And her daughter was able to say to her, "Mom, I was afraid that if you didn't come back to get me, I would miss you so much that I just took it because I wanted to take a piece of you with me." So even after all of these years, this daughter still had in her invisible suitcase this idea that maybe she would be sent away for the weekend and not go home, even after years of parenting, the commitment of adoption, and never ever a hint that things weren't going for life in terms of this family's commitment. And so Donna said it was really hard to do that, not only because it took some thinking for me to do that, but also, her mother and her brother and her friends were like, "What are you thinking? What did you do to her? What was the consequence?" And Donna had to say, "Well, the consequence, there wasn't one. I went out and bought her own necklace. And then I said to her, 'Honey, if you think you need a piece of me to feel safe, we're going to go get you your own necklace from me, and you'll always have it, and you'll never have to worry about losing me or missing me that much.'" And her friends and her family were you bought a thief, the thing she stole. And so she needed people, allies, who are using this paradigm shift, this trauma-informed lens to parenting, to be supportive enough so that she could continue to sustain. And that's sort of my major message, is that in order to keep the conversation going after the training, you need to think about sustainability from the very beginning, and that requires planning and partnering. And the major force in planning and partnering are your trauma-informed parents. Start with your low-hanging fruit. Start with your parents who are most likely to try this or who are already doing some really unique trauma-informed parenting but perhaps just don't have the language to know that that's what it's called. And then use them for your pilot. And then when your pilot's over, sit down with them and say, "Okay, was this a good use of your time? If so, how should we do it again? Who should be there? How should we do it? How can you be part of this process?" Because, as everyone has said already, the interaction between each other is at least, if not more so important than the material itself, and they need to be part of the process so that it's not about them without them. Next slide, please. So some of the concrete suggestions for continuing the conversation, for keeping a place to talk about using this trauma lens long after the training event continues, is on this slide. And we talk about the first one being coaching. When I was working with a caseload of foster parents as a social worker, one of the things I did very quickly after we started doing this training was included regular questions, assessments, and check-ins. Every time I talked to my families, they kept asking about, the impact of trauma, behavioral symptoms as symptoms of trauma experiences, and whether caregiver responses are directed towards what's informing the behavior instead of trying to control the behavior. I think the biggest shift for me personally was when someone called and they were struggling with a kid and a behavior and they didn't know what to do. It used to be that I would start to throw out suggestions. "Well, have you tried this or this or this?" And now, instead of doing that, I take a breath and I say, "What thought, belief, or expectation do you think they might be trying to prove with that behavior?" And so instead of trying to fix it, we try and understand it. We've also done peer consultation, and we call these sort of booster trainings. They take some of the major concepts in the curriculum and review them. And we review them using case examples, role plays, interactions where families can learn and review the concepts, but practice doing these case reviews together where they're all brainstorming together what might be happening to inform this behavior and how can they come up with suggestions or solutions using these reviewed concepts. And what it does is it just offers more opportunities to practice applying the ideas to specific real-life kind of situations. Case reviews have been a little bit different in that we have families bring case presentations similar to what I've done in my professional practice in peer consultations. So people take round-robin turns presenting a case, and we often do these on monthly conference calls so that people don't have to travel. We offer training credits for the time of the conference call. We include social workers who are assigned to the foster homes or the resource families, sometimes the clinical case managers that are involved in the families. And we have these monthly conference calls to practice presenting cases, talking about what was tried. So I used the cognitive triangle in this example, and it really sort of helped, but I'm wondering if there's something else I could be trying. and using that peer consultation model to validate families' expertise as they're developing this expertise, providing opportunities for them to mentor and support one another, and also demanding and encouraging professionalism on the entire team, where it's not, I'm the social worker, I'm supposed to come up with the answers, but I'm the coach, and you're in the trenches, and how do we work together to figure out how to use this material in these homes during these interactions. The ongoing psychoeducational support groups, the one that I know the most about is here in Madison, and it's what Shannon, who was the first speaker today, talked about, and it's her It's Not About You group. And part of the reason it's called It's Not About You is because we weren't very creative when it came to naming it, but also the conversation that we kept having when we designed this group was, when often these kids act out, the behavior isn't about you as a parent. It's not because you're a bad parent or you're a good parent. It's about their experiences and their expectations. And so the It's Not About You group became a monthly 2-hour psychoeducational support group. Shannon runs it. She brings in new information every month that's from a trauma perspective, but there's always a new educational component as well as a review component. But I think what's most exciting is the support piece, where people are able to come in with struggles, share those struggles, and support one another in trying to figure out how to apply a trauma lens to each interaction. The training, we give training credit for the 2 hours every month. And at first I was involved in the process because we weren't sure how we were going to develop it. And then quickly we decided that I would divorce myself from the process entirely. And now it is completely foster parent owned and led. And that's to create a safe place for people to interact with each other, to acknowledge their professionalism and expertise. Though it is facilitated, so there isn't the concern that it's going to turn into a venting session or that it's going to be not trauma-informed. We also have engaged multiple co-facilitators. The first time I did this training, like I said, I had maybe 6-7 families as my pilot, and then I brought them into a meeting and I said, all right, how do we do this again, or should we? And those families immediately said, this is how we should do it, this is who we should invite, and this is how we're going to make it happen. And those families became my co-facilitators for the next implementation of the training. And it was by accident, but it turned out that we now do it on purpose. And that's that we have 5 or 6 co-facilitators every time I have a training group of 25 to 30 people. And the reason I do that is because even though there are a lot of foster families, resource parents, who don't necessarily want to give a lecture or do formal public speaking, there are a lot of families who get really excited about the tools offered in this curriculum and are excited to share it with other families and are willing to do that in small group discussion. So often what I'll do is I will lead some of the lecture, and then the co-facilitators will continuously pepper my lecture with real-life examples of implementation. And what's happened is that those families have gone through the curriculum now many times, have not only learned it but led it, which takes it to a deeper integration of the concepts, and have now become mentors to other families in the community. They use social media to support each other. They mentor new participants. They create safe environments for families to struggle and not feel like they have to be perfect, and not be judged when they do things that they wish now in hindsight that they hadn't have done. And so it's really created a strong source of sustainability and spread that I never would be able to do on my own. And that's why I say include stakeholders in the learning and the leading. Get them involved from the very beginning, not because it's a good idea, because it's essential to keep the conversation going. It has to be, again, not about me without me. I now have families who are going around, and I joke on this slide that I use them, and I'm comfortable with the idea that I use people, because they're brilliant, and they are out in the community, and they are doing their own trainings. Shannon's been hired by a school district to help do some training for some special ed teachers who are struggling and seeing that she's having a lot of luck with her kids, and they want to know more about what she's doing. Donna is in the top part of the state, and she is doing some training on her own, but she's also been hired to be on a board of directors for a mental health agency because they have observed her success with her number of children and want to know more about what she's doing. And I've had families who have gone to state and national conferences and presented because they are out there advocating in a way from a real-life, first-hand perspective, and people are excited to hear what they're doing, and that's just constantly reinforcing and supporting the message that we're trying to get across with the RPC, but also we're changing the stakeholders and the community in general and the culture of approaching kids who are in the child welfare system. So with that, I'd like to pass this on to Sue.
Good morning, everyone. This has been such a great session, and like someone else said before me, I have learned new things myself from the other co-presenters, even though we talk to each other a lot. Just listening has been really great. I think it was terrific that planning that this webinar started with the voice of a current foster parent who is really doing this work in her home and in the training and support group environment. Shannon was excellent. And then throughout you heard that some of the other co-presenters also have their own experience with parenting these children who experience trauma in their homes. And then as we come to me and my portion is to talk a little about the national perspective, but I also have most of my learning over my life has come from my own experience as a foster and adoptive parent. And I'm a lot older than Shannon, and so my experiences in the early years, I didn't have access to any of these kinds of resources, and so I've been able to sort of take that long view or that view from the balcony, as the slide says, in more than one way, the view from the balcony over time and the view from the balcony across the whole sort of national picture. So I do want to go back in time a minute and just talk about sort of my own getting started as a foster parent, and then why, to me, it's so important and exciting that we have this resource available to parents around the country, and then how that fits in to the broader concept of really improving the whole systems that interact with the children and the families that have experienced abuse or neglect. But it was over 32 years ago when my husband and I first became foster parents, and after doing that for just a year and a half or so, we already had 23 teenagers in our home, 5 or 6 at a time, but after less than 2 years, we had 23 youth in our home. And at that point in time, I was given an opportunity to testify at our state legislature about the budget needs of our foster care system. And so as I was reflecting on what I needed to say to them and thinking about the 23 young men, we had all boys at that time, who had been in our home, I did some little bit of math and realized that these young men had spent an average of 11 years in foster care and had had an average of 9 moves each time. And since, of course, this included some for whom our home was their actual first stop in the system, it meant that for many others, their entire lives had been spent in foster care, moving 24 or more times. And so, as it turned out, my turn to speak to the legislature was immediately after the person who was speaking for the agriculture budget in our state. And I was in Vermont, a very rural and farming kind of state, and everyone had some personal connection to the agriculture budget. So, as I prepared to share with the legislator my thoughts, I was really reflecting on the fact that I grew up in a family of farmers myself. And one thing that I had learned was that you couldn't take a healthy plant and uproot it and transplant it again and again and again, even if you had the best soil and best conditions every single time, and expect that plant to thrive and bear fruit. And as I shared this with the legislators, they nodded, and so then I said, and yet, this is what we're doing with our children. I shared the staggering numbers of years and multiple moves that just the children in my own home had experienced. And I asked them this question: if we know that we cannot do this to a plant, when will we understand that we cannot do this to a child? I didn't use words trauma or placement stability or permanence that day because, it was 3 decades ago and we weren't using that language yet. But that's what I was talking about. And that's where I really got the passion and the sense of urgency that we had to do something to make a difference so that this wouldn't continue to be the case for children in our communities. And there's been numerous improvements in the child welfare system and in communities that support children and families since that time. And yet, just a couple of months ago, I was asked to consult on a case in a process called a permanency roundtable that we do at Cape Family Programs, of a teenager that had been in 73 moves. 73 moves. It's just incomprehensible to me. And so that's just today. So if this is still true today, then we have to go back to that analogy and know that, no farmer worth his salt would do this to a plant. And so we have to really work to ensure that we don't do this to children. And so that's why I got involved with NCTSN, particularly in the development of the resource parent curriculum. And as one of the team that was part of the original writing and development of the curriculum, I was passionate about stating my belief that probably the single most important way to ensure that trauma-informed care for children would really be embedded in practice and make a difference in the lives of those children was if we really provided practical information and skill-building opportunities for parents and caregivers. So that's what got me jazzed up about participating in it and got me excited about working on it, and what just thrills me to hear the comments that you've heard already this morning on the webinar. And the picture I have here on this slide is a baby under a table, because I think that as it's rolled out, as this resource parent curriculum has rolled out in these wonderful and rich and exciting ways that you've heard about already on this webinar, it's still mostly been in pockets and in individual little places around the country. So I still consider it kind of the baby steps, the baby under the table, the baby feeling supported, and just taking those beginning steps to try to embed this work in the broader work of child welfare system improvement. And so I think what I'm hearing as I go around the country is we have to figure out how to move it from that kind of baby step approach into scaling it up and spreading it more broadly so that whole systems, whole states, whole communities will be embracing this approach to ensuring that every child in their system has access to trauma-informed caregiving, whether it's their own birth parents who are getting this kind of information and support so that the child can either never leave their family or be reunited safely, whether it's the resource parents themselves or adoptive parents who make those permanent commitments to the child. And so I would like to ask us to go ahead to the next slide and just share a few of the things that I'm noticing and seeing as I go around the country doing. Sometimes I'm kind of the one that's doing the rototilling of the soil to kind of keep to my farming imagery. I get called in to do a workshop on trauma-informed care to child welfare administrators, judges, lawyers, CASA volunteers. I was just training CASA volunteers yesterday in Louisiana. So I get called in, and I might be asked to do anywhere from an hour and a half to a full day in any particular jurisdiction. The audience in the room might include some resource parents that they've brought along, and this is kind of in many cases an introduction to the concept of becoming more trauma-informed. And they're beginning to these systems are recognizing that if they truly want to be trauma-informed in their work with all of their children, then it's not just about sort of launching a new initiative or, adding on one more type of practice to their existing practice model, but really about changing the whole culture of their work. And so I go in and I do that first level of sort of the rototilling of the soil, and in that process I use examples, anecdotes, some of the case information from that resource parent curriculum. I give them little teasers, and then I suggest and encourage that they really want to bring this on as one part of that culture change, that they want to make sure that their resource parents have access to this rich material. And that they view it really in that lens as being part of a larger culture change. As systems are trying to make that culture change, the first thing they often do turn to is training. Training of staff, as I just mentioned, training of partners in the community, stakeholders, and training of resource parents. But quickly what they learn as they do this training, and people get excited about it, they get so enthusiastic about it, that they want to spread it, they want to do more with it. You've heard all the enthusiasm on the phone of the 8 previous speakers, but they also realize that it's necessary but not sufficient, that the training itself just doesn't help people get to that next level if they don't have the adequate kinds of supports that they need in order to really embed this in their community and in their caregiving of children and in their practice. And you heard several of the speakers before me really talk about that issue, that there needs to be that whole continuing of the conversation, that there needs to be those ongoing supports for the caregivers. And so that's really what systems around the country now are grappling with. They're recognizing this. But they're also struggling because that does often involve some structural changes and infrastructure changes within their system, some supervision considerations as to how they'll supervise staff so that they can have trauma-informed supervision and encourage the staff to really work with families in this sort of new culture and this new way of thinking and doing work. Sometimes it involves some commitment of financial resources that were perhaps previously allocated elsewhere. So recognizing that training is necessary but not sufficient sort of leads to a whole host of other considerations, not just the considerations about keeping this conversation going that you just heard Chris talk about, but broader considerations about how does this really fit into our overall system improvement plan, and who else do we need to talk to, including from our legislature to our lead administrators, to our stakeholders, and our judicial system. So that's one thing that I'm hearing and seeing. Another is that many places are starting with offering training to resource parents, offering this specific curriculum, the RPC, to resource parents, and they haven't done some of that other culture shift work yet. And so resource parents end up having some frustration that as they try to implement what they're learning, their caseworkers that are coming into their home that are supposed to be there to support them and help them with these children are not on the same page, don't have the same language, haven't learned the same information, and often might be giving them contradictory advice. Seemingly good advice that we've used, for a long time. As you heard Shannon talk about, some of those basic sort of parenting tips that we always, thought were solid and can be solid for children who have not experienced trauma. So they'll have the caseworker saying, no, you need to do this, and you need to be firm, and you need to do this, and sort of contradicting what they're learning in the training. So we really, again, part of that sort of view from the balcony is how do systems think about ensuring that their case work staff and their supervisory staff are going to be able to have the same information and the same opportunity to use that information as the resource parents have, so they can all be on the same page. Another thing I'm seeing is that there really does need to be a developmental approach. Clearly we know that babies are not teenagers, but sometimes we just kind of offer this training in a void without really thinking about who are the resource parents we're reaching, who are the children in their homes, and who are the resource parents that are being the co-facilitators that you've been hearing about all throughout this webinar. And is there a match or a mismatch in terms of the developmental ages and stages of the children that they're caring for? And are there some unique or special things that need to be focused on when it's children under the age of 5 versus adolescents versus children, school-age children and so on? So really taking a developmental approach, again, not just to the RPC curriculum itself, but to that whole culture shift. Another thing is that the needs of caregivers have to be attended to, that many of the caregivers caring for children across the country in the child welfare system are kinship caregivers. And so they not only have the challenge of caring for the children, but they themselves may have experienced trauma. There may be multi-generational trauma going on in their family history. They have the trauma of whatever occurred to their son or daughter that life, so that they are no longer raising their own children, and that's why the kinship caregivers are now stepping in. And so their need to really be able to not only hear and learn this information and utilize it, but also to process some of their own experience with trauma has to be part of the whole approach. And that's not only true for kinship caregivers, of course, but for any caregivers. It's just more perhaps noticeable with the kinship caregivers. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to mention is that in order for all of this to work and for this culture shift to really be rooted in the community, the resources need to exist so that that continuum that you heard talked about earlier in the presentation of opportunities for families to go from having just that basic initial sort of pre-service training to having the RPC training, then the group therapy and individual therapy that Kelly talked about, those resources need to exist in the community. There needs to be those sort of trauma-informed, specific types of resources available that can be the backup and backbone to help support families and those who work with families as they continue to try to implement all of this information and all of these approaches. And that those resources mean we have to take a multi-system approach. We have to look at our Head Start agencies in our schools and our courts and our mental health agencies and pediatricians, and how do we reach them? How do we help them get on board with this information? And there are a few systems around the country that are really taking that multi-system approach. One that I've been involved with in my home community of Philadelphia is called Multiplying Connections, where really reaching out to all those different multiple systems and trying to help them figure out how to have this kind of good trauma-informed information and very concrete strategies and techniques accessible to anyone who touches the life of a child. And that will, of course, help those children, but it will also really help those resource parents who've received the RPC training and now can be in a sort of cultural milieu where it's supported and where they can really help the child to thrive. So that's the view from the balcony, from the national level, that I wanted to share. Again, I'm really excited about this work going forward. I think it just gives so much hope to our families who are caring for children and to our systems who really want to make a difference and reduce the impact of trauma in the lives of children. So on that note, I want to turn it back to Jennifer, I believe, so that we can have some time for questions.
Great. Thank you, Sue. And thanks to all of the panelists. Those were very great presentations, and everyone had a really nice sort of different perspective on the workshop. We don't have too much time left for questions and answers, but I'll just encourage you anyway to submit them. If we aren't able to get to your questions, we'll post them up on the Ask the Master Trainers forum on the Learning Center site, and we'll have the panelists respond to them later. And of course, if you come up with questions at any point, a day from now or a week from now, again, please use the forum on the Learning Center site, because we are we'll be checking back regularly, and also it's a great way to sort of share some of the struggles that you're dealing with and get some discussion going. We do have, so to remind you how you can submit a question is to click on the bubble icon, which is in the upper left corner of the screen. And if you're listening by phone, not over the web, you can send an email to question@nctsn.org. And we have one question, so maybe we'll start with this. And the question is that since foster care is provided typically either by private agencies who contract with departments of social services or through departments of social service themselves, what strategies have been effective for gaining access to these agencies and systems to introduce the curriculum and partner with them to get them to adopt the curriculum as an ongoing part of their practice? Does anyone want to respond to that?
Well, this is Sue. I'll take one crack at giving a beginning response because it really relates to what I was saying in my part of the presentation. I think sometimes it's about seeding the soil by having sort of an orientation or introductory kind of workshop on trauma-informed care and what is trauma 101, as we sometimes refer to it. And private agencies I've seen in many jurisdictions can really be a catalyst to make that happen and to pull together either at a conference or at a special just one-time community event, and to bring people together from the child welfare system, from the courts, from CASA, from private provider agencies of mental health, and to have that sort of one workshop that's not this depth of the RPC, but that introduces some of the concepts and gets them excited and kind of whets their appetite that they need more. And then I've seen multiple times come out of that request for, okay, how do we get this? How do we do this in our community? How do we bring this here? So I would suggest that that's one strategy.
Yeah, and this is Chris Foreman, and I've done this training and been involved in state, private, and county organizations. And really, what's always worked for me is starting with a couple of people, helping them understand and learn this information, and then resource families are in multiple systems every single day. They're in schools, they're in the courts, they're working with attorneys, they're working with law enforcement, they're working with foster care. And when people in these different organizations see that what they're doing is working, they start asking questions about why and how. And so we've never really had to break into any system. We just started, again, with a pilot of just a few families, and the placement stability in those families changed so dramatically that all of a sudden people started to take notice and ask questions. So what Sue, I think, was talking about was more of a macro perspective. What's worked for me is more of a grassroots, just demonstrate the effectiveness, and then the word spread like wildfire.
This is Kelly. I have another approach too, I guess, for everybody to keep in mind is that, sometimes, we didn't come at it from the grassroots approach because we were like a network site and we were like, there's this great thing and we need to get it out to people. And so we went this other way with it, which could be unrealistic, but I'm going to pitch it to everybody just in case anyway, is that we decided we just really wanted to do this, and so we wrote grants to give us funding to be able to do it. And essentially, when we contacted agencies about this and said, we can do this for free, they were like, come on. So that was a big part of the reason why I think we were able to start this initiative, which I know is not an option for everyone to do. But that was another approach that people can take until it starts to catch really good fire, and then the funding hopefully can come from the agencies themselves.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm going to pose one more question. That might be all we have time for, and that is from an agency that has been working with a master trainer who's from outside of the agency to implement the training for them. And they're wondering, what is the next step if they would like to start implementing the full curriculum themselves for their foster parents? What's sort of the process of, getting the training, the consultation, and sort of moving on to being able to deliver it independently?
And where did you say that? Where did you say they were in the process for this particular question, Jen?
They just say that they're working with the master trainer who's delivering the training. It sounds like doing the training for them, for the parents that are being served by their agency.
Okay, so they're already working with the master trainer to, I would assume, probably facilitate the training.
Right.
Well, I think that it greatly depends on what that person has access to, what they've talked about in terms of what would be needed, what the master trainer recommends. But I think that, I think we should deal with these kinds of things on a case-by-case basis to figure out what's going to be feasible for people to do, and take feasibility as well as best practice into consideration with all scenarios. That's generally what I would say, but do other people have thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is Sue. I think if I'm understanding the question right, they've brought in a master trainer from another jurisdiction, but now they want to kind of own this perhaps in their jurisdiction, and how do they build the capacity to continue offering this and supporting it once the master trainer leaves their town. So maybe I misheard that, but that's part of what I thought I got from the question. And in that instance, I think that's where it's really important that the master facilitator that's come in from the other jurisdiction has co-facilitators from within the jurisdiction, and preferably resource parents, as we've been talking about all morning, who can then really be the first set of leaders in their local community to take it to that next step, to really embed it in their local practice and to be the champions for it. And so I think that whenever a community brings in a master practitioner from outside, they should work with that person to ensure that they have local co-facilitators who are committed to not just co-facilitating this one session, but to working on a steering committee or something to help move it to the next level. So that would be part of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what Sue is saying is very consistent with what's in the facilitator guidelines, what's recommended in terms of how it would actually take place. That you know the master trainer would train the next facilitators and co-train with them and that kind of thing. So that's the really the ideal way to approach it. And you know, I'm sure all the master trainers would help individual groups sort of figure out how they can balance what their capability is with how to do it with best practice too. And Jen, are you going to announce our implementer call?
Yes, I was just about to do that because I don't think we have time for more questions. So again, just as a reminder, if you do have more questions or if questions come to you in the future, please go ahead and post them on the Ask the Master Trainers forum. And if one person has a question, I'm sure many people probably have the same one, and we'd be happy to respond. We wanted to announce that the NCTSN Resource Parent Work Group is planning a teleconference discussion on implementation issues. The date and time and specific topic is going to be announced on the Learning Center site. So that's not set yet, but the discussion will be open to anyone who's currently implementing the curriculum or who's preparing to implement it. And the teleconference discussion is intended to be more interactive, so it will give, you'll actually be able to speak with some of the master trainers and network members on the call, and it will give participants on the call an opportunity to share what you are doing with the curriculum in your community and ask questions and so forth. So that's the next thing that we're going to plan. So please check back to the Learning Center site for information about that. We'll be announcing the details of our winter Resource Parent Curriculum Implementation webinar. So we'll do another webinar again in a few months, and we'll, again, post that information on the Learning Center site as well. So please stay tuned. Post your questions on the forum. And again, thanks to all of our great panelists, and thanks to all of you for joining us.